And we are on, and now I am going to start recording, so we will officially begin. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the GCCA Art Talk, revolving around our Constellations exhibit, now available for viewing in our main gallery. We are so excited to have assembled a wonderful panel with us tonight to discuss how the exhibit and how art in general can really lend itself toward community building and exploration of mapping of culture and a number of different social issues. Before we get started, I just want to welcome everyone who is joining us on the Zoom call, as well as those who are joining us on Facebook Live. Thank you for being here. We're really happy to be bringing this programming to you during these really strange times. I'm joined on the call tonight by my colleague, Liz Rundorf-Smith, who is the program director at Greenville Center for Creative Arts. Liz, give a little wave there so everybody knows who you are.
Hello.
Liz is going to be helping facilitate the chat later on. Just a couple housekeeping items. We are going to do a moderated panel for the first 30 or so minutes, and then we will move toward more of a Q&A format, and you can type your questions that you would like to ask the panelists in the chat box when we open up the Q&A portion. I'd like to start out by thanking the sponsor for our art talks throughout the year, Abacus Planning Group. They have been staunch supporters of Greenville Center for Creative Arts. And during these challenging times when a lot of sponsors are pulling back on their funding, Abacus has remained true to us. And we are so very grateful for their support, and especially from the folks who are in the Greenville area from Abacus, Laird Green, and Anne-Marie Ashworth. Thank you so much for your support. I see that, that you're on the call. Laird, thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank Tiger Strikes Asteroid for curating such a wonderful exhibit for us, and so timely for what the whole world and our community is going through right now. So thank you for that. Also, special thanks to Dr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Lawson, who is making it possible to have these folks here with us tonight. So next, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator this evening, Mark Brosseau, who is co-director of Tiger Strikes Asteroid Greenville. Mark will introduce our panelists and start the conversation. So back to you, or over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled that we were able to make this happen despite the sort of difficult situation that we seem to constantly be finding ourselves in over and over and over again. But, you know, we've discovered this wonderful medium that we can now use, and the world will never be the same. So I want to introduce the panelists. First, we have Uchechi Kalu. Hopefully I said that right. She is the co-host and co-executive producer for a podcast called The Buddy Pass, in which she and a close friend explore the human stories behind Black people who've left the American dream behind to thrive in unexpected countries around the world. She's a South Carolina native based in Greenville. Next, we have Jonell Logan. Jonell is an independent curator dedicated to supporting artists, transforming communities, and creating accessible creative spaces. She is executive director of the League of Creative Interventionists and founder of the 300 Arts Project. And finally, we have Juan Logan, who is one of the artists in the Constellations exhibit. He's a painter or should not only a painter, he paints and does a lot of other things, who lives and works in Belmont, North Carolina. His artwork addresses subjects relevant to the American experience. At once abstract and representational, his paintings, drawings, sculptures, installations, and videos address the interconnections of race, place, and power. And that sort of description of Juan's work really kind of, I think, was sort of the impetus behind putting this exhibition together. Like, I've always viewed art as a kind of exploratory tool. And navigation is an exploratory process. You know, now we think of maps as directions, but when maps were first made, they were actually just the record of an investigation, not a set of directions. And so when I put this show together, I was thinking about the ways that art can be used to navigate a variety of things. Like I navigate space in my paintings, but we're now, you can navigate culture and whatnot. And with everything that's going on and the nature of Tiger Strikes Asteroid, which is really sort of a community building project through art, I was thinking about the idea of artists as navigators of community and what our role is in that process. And so that's how this panel came together. So I've got a question that I'd like all of you, we're going to start with a question for all of you. We're hearing a lot right now about things that divide us, but there are also many efforts to bring people together. Can you describe a time in your life when you felt the strongest sense of community and the elements that came together to create that feeling? And whoever wants to start can start. Unless you're going to make me call on someone.
I guess I will call myself. Very good to be here. Very good to be among you all. When I think about this question and connecting to the work that I create, I've lived abroad and I've lived in lots of places around the world for maybe the past decade. And so one of the most unexpectedly cosmopolitan and like incredibly inclusive places on earth that I lived is Beijing. And it's kind of the impetus of the podcast that we ended up creating. And so Beijing brings people from all over the African diaspora, brings people from all over the Asian diaspora. I mean, you'll meet someone who's from like Mauritius and Kazakhstan in the same room, but then also from like the far west of China, the far north of China, the far east of China, really kind of everywhere in that same space. And what was really amazing, I lived there for 4 years, and I think it was the work of artists who were creating, like we created community events. I opened galleries, there were dance performances, artists who were just kind of looking around and saying, we're all these different people who've landed in this very unique place on earth. And we're trying to tell our collective story, like the collective story of the kind of communal harmony that I think it's really unexpected to describe it in this way, but truly the communal harmony that we all felt living in that space, both foreign and Chinese, some speaking Mandarin, some not speaking Mandarin. And so a lot of what brought the community together were communal arts events that people of different nationalities brought to life. So that's what my experience would be.
I think there have been many times in my life when I've experienced what you're talking about. Certainly living through the whole civil rights movement, when community truly came together for a common cause. Artists came together to address that cause in really wonderful ways. And I think that that sort of set me off in terms of early on in my life anyway, in terms of the direction that my life pursued, my work pursued. And over the years, I was thinking back to Elizabeth Catlin and I were doing a show together, and we talked about the whole notion of social as opposed to political. And she said that political simply means that you're addressing a particular, or you're owning, if you will, a particular position. Social simply means you're addressing the things that are going on around you. So I spent a lifetime sort of addressing those things that were going on around me, and often it included community, many times with public works and that sort of thing. But more often than not, I've simply tried to ask questions that could get, community and or others involved in what was taking place all around us.
So I guess it's my turn. I think it's interesting. So I, and really putting it in an arts context, have been in institutions and formal institutions in the arts for a really long time. And then I stepped away because the notion of supporting artists and creating community was something that I was kind of in conflict with some of the structures of organizations. And so my work at the League has been really interesting because the core of that work is thinking about how do you take a practice that historically in a traditional context has been independent, and insular. And in some ways, the way that we kind of share work exclusive and really make kind of an inclusive process. And so I think some of the projects that have been done as part of the league where like you are truly using that creative process that I think you talked about earlier to challenge, I think, notions of like how we live and where we live, challenging the idea of who the problem solvers are in community, and then bringing everyone to the table creatively to try to address it and not solve it, because we can't fix everything. But this notion of ownership through creative process to kind of transform where we are and how we live really exemplifies, I think, the concept of community for me. So whether it's, you know, like being out on the side of a highway that had been decommissioned and like replanning what was supposed to be a temporary project, a park looked like, so that it could last kind of in community and hand it over to community so that it's truly about their leadership and it becomes their space. You know, from that to having these kind of conversations with people in community where they help plan like interventions, which are like random kind of events that happen, so that artists are like in parking lots with hard hats, handing out like work orders for Charlotte, where we are, so that they can, you know, be responsive to some of the issues that people want fixed. I think really is an example of that for me.
I'm gonna try to get through without talking while I'm muted, but I'm not making any promises. Excellent, that was great. Our next question for everyone, and I'm gonna start with Juan on this one. What is your concept of the role of the artist in the community, in particular when it comes to bridging different paths of communities or building community?
You know, it's interesting. I was working on a project for about 7.5 years down in Wilson, North Carolina, the Vala Simpson Whirligig project. I was managing the restoration of about 31 sculptures. And it was interesting that the Vala Simpson, being the artist in that particular case, made all the difference in the world in terms of that community. We were able to locate 31 major pieces of sculpture by him in a park in downtown Wilson, which in turn basically changed the entire community. They are sort of rebuilding the community around that park. New hotels, new housing, breweries, you know, I mean, everything impacted that community in a major way, in a wonderful way. But it was all because of his art. And I think that in regardless of the community, that happens all the time around the country. And it's often really wonderful to see what Jonell is doing with the artists that she works with, because they change their communities. I mean, they really do. From the housing, the food desert in Charleston, South Carolina, and seeing that actually transformed and actually provide, I mean, artists in a very, very different kind of way, but provide real nourishing food for the entire community. It changes the community. So I think we impact communities in so many ways. We really do. Oftentimes it's simply a matter of making people, hopefully making them more aware of what's going on around them, because I mean, we've all heard the statement, I just didn't know that was going on. And my response, of course, is always, well, how could you miss that? It's happening in your backyard. So that's all. Can't hear you, Ma.
All right, well, okay, I failed already. Maybe Jonell next, and then Uchechi with that same question.
Okay, you have to, I apologize. Can you ask the question again?
Of course. What is your concept of the role of the quote unquote, artist in the community, in particular when it comes to bridging different parts of communities or building community?
So I think artists have a number of roles in community, right? I think okay, let me start over. I think if I'm trying to like not frame the question in a very nice way, I think artists really are the folks that can take chances, right? they can elevate issues and questions and beauty in a way that we often feel that we can't do for some reason, right? That we're challenged by what is proper, who we have access to and don't have access to. Will I say it the right way? I think there's a level of experimentation and risk and being willing to be out there that artists inherently have, that allows them to question, to be like champions for some of the questions that community have, and to kind of break down some of the boundaries that exist for community, or even for like some of the things that we just don't want to talk about. So I'm thinking about, so I recently have shifted roles, and it's an interesting moment. So I'm now at the McCall Center in Charlotte as their creative director, and working with their artists in residence who are engaged in community as intentionally as part of the program. And so one of the artists was trying to have like political conversations now, like before the election, which, everyone already was like, that might not be a good idea. But what he was framing it around was a volleyball game, right? And so like this idea of play and volleying kind of ideas and connecting back to history. So the game was actually a representation of, and I know I'm going to get it wrong because I'm not super strong in this history in this moment, but like a battle that happened in, I think, in and around Delaware. So like somewhere around there, and I'll get the clarification of where. But just this whole idea of like experimentation and play and having tough conversations and connecting it to history and bringing down either people's boundaries or totally tapping into like our competitive nature, so that like you're actually playing, but then also thinking about how to build community during COVID in a way that's like socially distanced and safe. Right. So like even the idea of bringing all those things together in a single project is only something that an artist, I think, can do. And then being willing to take that chance, right? When everyone else is being super careful and super cautious about how we're having conversations, or should we even kind of engage because people are so kind of separate, that he's willing to take that chance, and willing to frame it in a way that is different from the traditional conversation. This isn't what you're hearing on the news, right? This isn't, kind of, it could be family kind of playing against each other, but the dynamic is shifted. And so I think that artists really offer that to community, and if supported, can do so much more of that in our spaces and neighborhoods, and like just with it for all of us, because there's a level of risk and trust and curiosity that they have.
I think, in addition to what has been stated here, I think that when I see the role of the artist in community, I see the artist as a historian, one who is able to look at the history that is right there in front of us, but maybe no one has ever talked about. I'm a teacher as well. And I teach humanities, which is at the cross section of lots of things, but I look at it at the cross section of history. And it's really kind of wild, all the things we don't know. And so when we started our podcast, it was primarily because after having left America and lived in many, many places around the world, we realized, oh my gosh, we have a really strong and very long history of African Americans who have left the United States, who have made crossroads all over the world, and yet we don't know any of these stories. And yet I remember one of my last months living in Beijing, me and a friend went looking for the grave of the second wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. which was supposedly in Beijing in a very particular graveyard. We went there, it was not there, she was not buried there, but she had actually been given a huge parade because of the life that she had lived and because of her impact in China. So I think what artists can do on one hand is raise a glass to the histories that are all around us, and that actually speak to, I don't like the word allyship, so I'm trying to find another word, that speak to cross histories, that speak to the way, I've never met Jonell, I've never met Juan, but might speak to the ways that our stories are linked, but we just didn't know because an artist didn't find the way to tell that story in a way that could open up someone's mind or heart or just ears in a different way. And then I think also community, I think real community, right? We think of community as a bit of kumbaya, like let's all get along, but I don't think of community as such. I think that the strongest communities are the ones where you truly can ask each other the real questions. You truly can like get on each other's nerves. You truly can be like, I'ma just take 10 minutes away. Like, I know you're coming at me in good faith, but I can't look at you right now. That's for me, that's really community. And so in that way, I think that an artist can be a really good provocateur to have people start talking about things that's there, but we're just not saying. So I remember, I think I've only told a few people that I ever did this as a project, but I'll tell you about it here. For a while, I was kind of really obsessed with the idea of who is the tyrant and who is the revolutionary. There's a very, very fine line. And I chose like some people that from the American perspective would definitely be the tyrant. So also depending on who you are in America. So I took some very racist speeches from like post-Reconstruction, some from like the 1960s, speeches from Osama bin Laden, speeches from Fidel Castro, but then also from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And I didn't actually change like any language from anyone. I just took sentences from here, and there, and put it all in one speech. And so depending on who read it, from whose actual voice, was it a Black woman or a Latin man or an Asian American person like this, you would have a very different feeling as to what that person was saying, even though you didn't even know the actual source that it was coming from. And for me, just that question of, okay, who do we choose to follow and why do we choose to follow them is actually not as clear cut as we would like to think. And actually like who we see as like the tyrant for those people, but the leader for us, again, is not as clear cut as we like to think. So I think that the artist in community can raise that gray area to the pedestal that it needs to be on, so that we are all a bit more, always more nuanced, but also way more humble.
One thing I also wanted to say, Mark, earlier this year, when the pandemic was just getting going, we decided that the gallery within New York decided to raise money for the frontline workers. So all these artists from around the entire community of New York donated work and that sort of thing to raise money for those frontline workers. So it's called Feed the Frontline. And it took, in terms of bringing community together, and the role that artists could play and did play was really important and really major.
Great, thank you all. I just had a thought especially while Jonell was speaking, where it dawned on me that I feel like in my role as an artist, the thing that is free about being an artist for me is that I never am pressured to focus on answers. Like, I can just think about the questions, and I think that that's something that's really singular to artists. And this is a very broad view of artists. But the answers are never really that important. It's just about asking the questions and pushing forward. Okay,
I agree.
Is for Jonell. I'm sorry, Juan, did you have something?
No, I said I totally agree. I've spent a lifetime simply trying to ask better questions. I think they're far more important than the answers. And my answers answers I'm seeking are for me and not for the, the general public, if you will.
All right, this question is for Jonell. There's a seeming contradiction in the art world, and I'm going to frame this as the kind of accepted traditional art world, let's say, that artists think critically and ask questions about structures in place, yet the art world is one of the most conservative and market-driven structures. Again, the thing that we think about when we hear art world. How do these structures prevent access to a more diverse population of artists? And then since Alex isn't here, I'm going to tag on his question. How can these structures be adapted to be more inclusive?
So yes, to all of that. Traditionally, the arts world was constructed to exclude an entire population of people, some of whom look like me. And it's interesting because probably for the past 15 years, maybe, institutions have been kind of recognizing that. And some have been working to kind of take that on, right? So what stories are we telling? How are we telling it? Who's included? Who's excluded? How do we kind of create spaces where people feel comfortable and welcome, especially those who have not traditionally been included? But we've still, if you kind of look at social media and other places, and like Museum Hue, we recognize that those environments are still not as inclusive as they either desire to be in the best case scenario, or pretend to be for dollars and recognition and quotas and all that, right? Can places be more inclusive? Absolutely. Should communities own their organizations? I think they should. And what does that look like? I mean, there's a lot. Who are you bringing in, not only as audience, but as staff? How are we representing artists in these spaces? One of the best exhibitions that I've been through, and I think it was strangely in Alabama, maybe, was going through an exhibition where artists were not African-American artists weren't labeled. They were artists in contemporary artists, period. So the conversations that were happening were not kind of automatically set up as separate, right? But that there was engagement happening with the work. And as you learned more about the artist, if you did the work, then you were able to kind of unpack a lot more. And so I think that initiatives or consciousness, it's not even initiative, right? It's being conscious about the story that you're telling, the framework that you're building, how you're educating your audiences, who's in the building, who's not in the building, are you out of the building? Are we treating this as sacred or as communal space? I think all of those things make a difference when we talk about the idea of challenging and changing the art world and kind of getting rid of some of these well-established foundations that are designed to keep it sacred. And it is a market. I mean, we're in it. So to recognize it is not a bad thing, right? It is a market. And it can be super exclusive when we think about who can acquire art. What are the narratives built around buying art and having it with you in your home, in your space? What do we expect that to say about people? And how do we value one person's collection over another? I remember my grandmother collected salt shakers, and they were beautiful and they were important to her. And she had a whole, not a vitrine, but when you collect
Curio cabinet.
Yeah, that, right? That was full of them, and she loved them. And I would argue that her collection is just as valid although it might not be as expensive as someone who has like, you know, the greatest hits of the 20th century, because the objects were loved and cared for. They spoke to her personally and culturally. And it did, I think they did the thing that art does, right? It brings us joy, it forces us to ask questions, it encourages us to invest. And I think that embracing that and shifting the art world in a way that is kind of more inclusive in that way, I think is important. And I think there are different like areas of the art world, right? So we recognize that galleries, they're created to show and encourage people to acquire, right? And so their framework is different. But what about artist-led spaces and what are they doing, right? What about community museums versus encyclopedic kind of houses of Western culture? Like there's so much room, I think, for engaging people and having people invest, not because we need members or dollars, but because we truly believe that culture belongs to everyone is key.
Thank you so much. So this is to Uchechi. In describing some of the artists or some of the changes or progress, in thinking about some of the changes and progress that Jonell was speaking about, what role can artists actively play in these changes?
Okay, I'll preface this by saying, you know, I don't think I have I wouldn't say I'm a part of like the art world, in any formal or even informal way.
I think it makes you perfect to answer this question.
So, okay, A+ if I'm the student. My answer here would be about ownership. I think that it's really, really important for artists to own their own work. Like, and I'm not just saying like, you know, own your work, like own your story. No, like actually like own your work. Own your production company, own your gallery, like whatever that thing is. Very often, like if I think about the podcasting space, you know, a lot of podcasts that we know and love today that have Black people as the heads of them are actually run by largely white production companies. And the struggle of it, I think, is kind of twofold. On one hand, so every podcast has an RSS feed, which is essentially like it's your goal. This is everything that you have created. But because, you know, NPR has been producing it, NPR owns your RSS feed. So you might have put in all this work and all this time, but you don't have any ownership over your own work. And it's like walking out with nothing. The other part of it is that if a production company owns your work, owns your story, then the stories that you create kind of are inevitably like what they want their audience to receive. So depending on who their audience is, you might not actually ever be speaking to anyone who is like you. You might not ever really be able to tell the stories that you want to tell. And for me, it's actually a little bit infuriating when I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm like, I kind of feel like they're all similar, but like have different names and slightly different topics. And it's for a reason. So for me, the main thing that I always focus on is like from day one, I want to own every bit of this, even if it takes me more time, even if it means like I'm walking away from this sponsorship or maybe that partnership or this and that. At the end of the day, I want to know that everything that I have created can be mine. And when it is mine, not that it's like, oh, this is for Uchechi, then it allows me to have the financial capabilities to bring up my community. I don't have to barter and say, okay, we're going to get there in 10 years. We're going to get there when this donor comes in. We're going to get there when that thing happens. Like, no, we can actually embed it from the start. So that's something that I just kind of encourage other artists to think like you're in business, not just that you are an artist on the side of the road. Like, some people get picked up, most people are not going to get picked up, but really think like a business person. How am I going to stay afloat? How am I going to make this happen? And when you do that, then you can actually create value for other people and bring people into the art that they themselves want to be creating but might not have the access to. So that's kind of my mantra.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Okay, this question is for Juan, and we've got about 5 more minutes before we're gonna start taking questions. Juan, can you describe how you have used your work as a way to talk about or navigate identity and community?
Nope.
Like all of your work.
Can't do it. I think I've tried for decades now to talk about who we are. I was looking at that earlier and thinking about it in terms of an experience I had when I was in Wisconsin. I was doing a residency at Kohler Company, and I was emptying my trash, and this woman who was on the other side of the this woman was emptying her trash. She saw me on the other side of the restaurant, and she was about 5 feet from the trash can. So in seeing me across on the other side of the room, she went back to her table, picked up her purse, and then emptied her trash. And I realized, of course, that one, she knew nothing about me. And I said, I could be the person that could save your life, and yet you are afraid of me. And I said, we're fast, we just aren't that fast, But the whole notion of that kind of situation, when same thing at a brat fire in Wisconsin, I was the only Black person in the room of about 200 or 300 people. And the guy said, well, you're not from here, are you? And I said, what was it, my accent? Because it's always a matter of seeing me, thinking you know me because of who I look like, my skin color and so on and so forth. And again, this whole notion of trying to negotiate that space all of my life in terms of trying to get beyond that. It's the whole notion of being an African-American as opposed to an American artist. It seems often necessary. I remember when Martin Puryear was representing the country, I think it's either in Venice or Brazil, Brazil, but it was the first time he had been written about as this American artist, as opposed to this African-American artist. And I said, why do we always feel it's necessary to talk about us in those terms? I don't mind it so much as only if you're not using it to marginalize me. Are those like me? So I think in trying to negotiate that space, we're constantly trying to understand exactly where others are coming from, not so much where we're coming from. We know that. It's the whole notion of, when we talk about history, and not necessarily art history, but the obligation to understand Eurocentrically based art history and history generally, as opposed to understanding more about the persons of color in this, globally. Since the world is 4/5 people of color, it seems that there will be an obligation to know more about them than the other way around. And yet, we know more about the less dominant culture, and we're not talking about dominant in terms of economically and so on and so forth, because that goes back to colonialism and how that came to be, and lots of other things come into play. But with all of that in mind, it's a constant struggle in terms of negotiating that space and navigating that space. More times than not, it is about survival than it is anything else. So again, in raising the questions, is it that you need to hear my questions so you can find your own answers? Or should I, on some level, try to provide you with answers as well? And I always felt that was never my job. I think if you want to know, then the information is there. It's always been there. It simply has been. It's a matter of what you want to know and for what reason, I suppose, more than anything else. If that answers your question.
That more than answers my question.
All right.
A lot to chew on for a while. All right, I think, we had one more question, but let's see if we've got questions from the group. If we don't, I'll ask this question. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for people to ask questions if they're interested. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat and we'll make sure it gets asked. And please don't be shy. All right, then, while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask the last question. This is for everyone. Can you share an example of how a community has successfully engaged artists create positive change?
I think Project Roadhouses is a really easy and great example. You know, where the whole idea of structures that are abandoned in community are then reclaimed and used by artists, not as a form of gentrification, because there's always that question about in kind of economically challenged neighborhoods, do artists equal gentrification? But the idea of the program being structured to bring something to community and involving the artists in community with commitment. I think that that's a wonderful example. I think that, and I think that there are so many artist led, because I'm blanking on, he's in LA, an artist, painter.
Mark Bradford?
Yes, Mark Bradford, thank you. It's, you know, today. So I'm like Mark Bradford, and like his program that he developed, just like that's in his, the neighborhood that he grew up in, that brings art to support the young people that are there, that is completely connected and rooted to community. I think that projects like that, that are led by artists, are often really successful, that are centered around and intentionally centered around the idea of being in the community, and not the idea that we'll be here for a little while and then we'll change the community around us to be what we think it should be. I think those kinds of projects are out there and incredibly successful, and also really important, because oftentimes they demonstrate that you can operate outside of that traditional art world that we kind of referenced earlier.
I mean, Theaster Gates is another really
Yeah,
great
exactly. Sure.
of what
You know, Mark, I think many times artists are asked to bring certain things, that's what Jonell's talking about as well, to communities. And rarely do we have the opportunity to select the communities where we would like to see our work appear. It's often the other way around, and it ends up showing up not so much in communities. I know some of my public pieces were always in public housing areas, because art would not normally show up there at all. And that was far more important than simply having it in a downtown community where those same people wouldn't get to see it at all. Mm-hmm. So I think it matters. It really does matter a great deal. And we tend not to think in terms of those communities when we're thinking about public art. I wish we thought of them more.
And
sorry, Jonell.
I just wanted to add one other person, Pearl Fryer, who's in South Carolina,
oh, yeah.
who
Mm-hmm.
does the topiaries. Like, I think even that, like, he doesn't even define himself as an artist, but so many people do, and it's completely transformed, I think, structure, the way people think, all of that. So, okay, I'm quiet now.
No, I've never heard of that, actually. I will add, there's an organization called, I think they're actually based out of Brooklyn, called Designing the We. And they would describe themselves as community organizers, but the way that they did this project is a very artistic way. They have a project called Redesigning the Red Line, Redesign the Red Line, where they all understand the history of redlining in a very comprehensive way, and then have created moving exhibits that go from community to community around the United States that has experienced redlining so clearly. So they've been in Baltimore, they were in different parts of New York City, I think they were also in Chicago. And when they're there, they don't just show up you know, in the middle of the street. They actually work with the community there to then create programming with students, with children, to then like create projects for their community. So it just becomes not something that we just see on the wall of like, oh, that's really interesting, now I'm gonna like go back to Netflix. It becomes this thing that's really embedded into life. And I think that's really when art for me like really takes off, is when you do the harder work to like kind of get people organized to do things. Which is so much harder than getting them to like show up at something. So that's an example that I always love to go back to.
All right, we do have a question from Lori. Lori's question is, how does an artist learn about opportunities to join a community project?
Oh, I can do that one.
I was hoping you could.
So there's a couple of ways. One, I would look at artists like wherever you are that are doing the work that you're interested in doing. Or if you like stalk them on Instagram and see that they're doing projects, like just DM them and like ask them how they got started, or connect with them in some way that is safe and it's 6 feet apart and wearing a mask if you're in person. So I think that's important. Also, it's really interesting. There are a lot of community-based programs that are happening in structures that we normally wouldn't expect. So a lot of cities are actually bringing artists and residents to do community projects, or they've launched kind of placemaking projects or placemaking kind of residencies. And they're often led by their city's urban design program. So if you kind of look into your city and you see that they're doing placemaking work, and that's like murals and street things and kind of wrapping their like junction boxes in images, like those are like clear out in the street signs that there's somebody in your city doing that work. So I would find out who they are and start to get into their network. There are often calls that you can kind of look at for public projects. But I think a lot of it, unfortunately, still in some ways is hidden. Like it's the thing that you have to do slightly more work for than like an exhibition. I think because it's somewhat new, sometimes people don't really know how to frame the work. But it's definitely happening in cities. And so I recommend kind of looking in those places. I also would check in with your local arts organization, because sometimes they have relationships that are already established and are aware of what's happening in community. And then finally, I think if it's not happening, start it. Like, you can do the work. My only concern or question that I would ask any artist who says they want to do work with community is to define like what that means for you. And if it's about you sprinkling knowledge or opportunity on people, it's probably not the work that you really want to do. Because doing community work is really transformative for you as the creative, because you have to learn how to work with people. You have to be humble. You have to like be okay if someone says to you that the mural that you're thinking about placing on this block, on this building, cannot happen or is trash, and this is why. Like, listen for the why. Because there's real history, there's real kind of memory, there's real legacy in these communities. And so if you're that invested in the work, be that invested in that history and legacy and community and those people, so that whatever you produce actually is true and honest and will live there because people are invested.
True enough.
Oh, you're welcome, Lori.
All right, Jonathan asks, I am just getting my feet wet as a professional artist. Uchechi mentioned the business side of this industry in regards to ownership. What should one do to begin navigating in this industry from a financial and business standpoint?
Well, understand that it can be a slow, long process, and know that going in. I think many times young artists, particularly, want to succeed almost immediately, and it's okay. I mean, I think we all struggle with getting things going and all of that, and that's fine. Just plan to be in it for the long term. I think the most important thing is understanding that is having your space, being able to work in that space, and being able to spend much of your time by yourself developing your work. And it really is about developing your work more than anything else. Art is long, life is short. It will be there long after you're gone. That is the hope anyway. And so spend time, understand how things work, who's doing what where in terms of the galleries, people that you can work with that will represent you on some level, realizing too that collaborating with other artists, doing collaborations even with businesses. There's so many ways, so many possibilities in terms of things that you can do. Just be willing to explore them all and find the best fit for you. There's no one shoe fits all. It just doesn't work that way. And again, know that it won't always be easy. It just isn't, and that's okay. But it has to be okay with you.
I would add that, like, very simply, like, go search. I could give you suggestions, but they would also be like what are on Google. Like, go search like top 10 business books and just read them. I think sometimes, like, people who are creative can feel also afraid of being like, but like that's the profession that I ran away from. Like, I don't want to know. But to Juan's point, like, making anything financially viable is going to take a long time. But what it also takes is a lot of collaboration. Like, never. It's like that Issa Rae quote where she I forget how she calls it, but like usually when you're like meeting people or you want to work into an industry or something, you're always looking above you, but just look around you. Like, network with the people who, and we say network, but just like work with the people around you. Be genuinely interested in like helping other people, because when they come up and they have a job or they have some work, they're gonna look and be like, oh, but what about Jimmy and Jill and Jack or whoever? So like, be with everybody who's in your space right now, because if you're in there for the long game, you're gonna move down a path together. And at the same time, educate yourself. Like, there's so much free stuff that's just in a library, just things you can read. And even though it might seem like, okay, if I read about like a robber baron and what they did, that might not be exactly what I'm doing. But no, they made something that was successful. They also like took advantage of a lot of people. So like, don't do that. But go find all the business books and just read them and take them in. And over time, you'll see what do you take for yourself. But I think you can never shy away from looking to your neighbor and actually asking them, how can I help you? Then you also learn better about your craft, but also you'll start to build relationships and see how the people who are around you are actually so valuable. There's like, whatever it is that they offer is actually so valuable. And I think what I keep on learning is like never to underestimate everyone in my community. So that's what I would say.
And one last thing, just understand that you're not going to do it yourself. It's always going to require the assistance of others. And that's okay. Embrace that.
Great, thank you. I think that brings this panel discussion to a close. I don't see any more questions, and that was wonderful. There's a lot to think about here. I'm glad that we recorded it because I'm going to go back and watch and listen again. And thank you so much. I don't have anything else to say. So, and if I do, I'll probably mute myself and then try.
Thank you for having us.
So much.
Thank you.
Mark. Thank you to all of the panelists and to everyone who joined us tonight in whatever media that you joined us. I do want to just mention that GCCA, Greenville Center for Creative Arts, is here to create a supportive arts community to help you all connect with each other, to help you connect with people across the country like we did tonight, and also to help build your skills as artists as well as the business side. So please do look to GCCA to help you make those connections, and look at our course catalog, not only to build your skills, but also to join our community. So we want to have you be part of us. You are welcome there. Can't thank you all enough, panelists, for joining us tonight and for making this work out in the environment that we're living in today. And hopefully we're making it available to many, many more people than might have been able to come to GCCA. So this has been such an enlightening evening and very timely topics. Thank you.
I just want to say, make sure to go see Constellations before it's down on November 25th. I think it's the last day. I'm really proud of the show, and I wish it was a little bit more accessible, given, you know, the bodily harm that could come from trying to go see it right now. But it's worth the visit, and GCCA will protect you.
Well, I'll just mention that the gallery is open Wednesday through Friday from 1 to 5. So open gallery time. Anyone can come in. We just ask that you wear a mask. And so there's certainly time to still see it. And just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your time. I wish that we could be in a room with maybe a glass of wine, but that'll just make us enjoy that all the more when we can do it. We can watch Mark for now. And thank you for bringing this to GCCA. We really appreciate it.
Cheers, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed.
Thank you.